I too am a millennial woman. Here I am in the wild. Although I am what's known as like a cusper. I'm a zennial, so I'm the one of the oldest millennials. I was born in 1982, and I think the cutoff is 1980. So if you played Oregon Trail as a child, you're also a member of this generation. If you had to like go to the computer lab to do your work in college and to like print out papers, you were a member of this generation.
I love this. I
So,
think maybe I am too, because I was born 83, and
yep.
my metric is if you had body hair and dial-up internet at any point overlapping in your life, you're not really a millennial. Like unless you have like a medical condition where you had body hair at 4, but like in the normal development of puberty, if you came of age while it's still on the dial-up internet in your house, then
If you
you're
had body hair at 4 and dial-up internet, you really missed the window to have an incredibly unique OnlyFans because that didn't come until much later. So yeah, I think it's actually great to be in this kind of cusper generation, micro generation, because I feel like I observe the millennials who are the millennials everyone complains about coming up behind me like I'm a sort of an anthropologist. I'm not really of them, but I have like a toe in the world, the same way I have a toe in the media sphere. So I do write a lot about generational stuff, millennial women stuff. I write about feminism, I write about culture, I write about sex and politics and the way they intersect. I got my start as a reporter at MTV News. That was kind of my big break into journalism. And so I come at my work as both a novelist and a journalist from the perspective of how can I relate this in some way to some pop culture phenomenon? Like there's certainly a Batman movie or a Mean Girls or something that's like relevant to this incredibly serious cultural issue that we're discussing. So Anna asked me to
I'm
describe
sorry
my
to interrupt, but one of the articles by you that we included in the reading list for this event was "We are all mean girls now," but as mean girls as in the film and the remake.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So Anna asked me to describe my trajectory into being a writer, which I'm going to try to do as quickly as possible because it is really convoluted. I did not dream of being a writer. I didn't study writing in high school or college. When I graduated, I knew that I needed a job with a salary and benefits. I was hoping to move to New York City and live there. And so I understood that journalists were a thing that existed, but I didn't really know any. I had a distant uncle who was very elderly and died in the late aughts. Really understand what he did either. So to me, the idea of a journalist, it was like, somebody sitting in a hovel wearing fingerless gloves, typing on a typewriter. They were probably starving. There were definitely a lot of rats. I was like, I don't think I can do that. So I got a job as a publicist, or rather a publicity assistant at a book publishing house. And I did this because I liked to read and I thought that this made sense. And so I got this job not realizing that publishing is one of these prestige industries where you make no money and you're not expecting to make any money because you're supposed to come from like family wealth or you're supposed to be married to somebody rich. I completely just missed that part of things. I was very naive when I saw my colleagues living in like really nice apartments in the East Village. I was like, they must be so good at Craigslist. Like they must have found the best deal on Craigslist. Why am I so bad at finding apartment listings? So I worked in publicity for, I want to say 3 years. And in the course of doing that job, I did have a lot of contact, not just with authors who were writing the books that I was promoting, but also journalists who were writing about the books. And after a few years, I realized that number one, I was a terrible publicist. And number two, I hated it. And I really did not want to be doing what I was doing. I wanted to do what the journalists and writers that I was having contact with on the daily were doing. And so at that point, I decided I would pivot into something more writing focused. I had just gotten married, so I had health insurance through my husband. I was able to quit my job, go freelance. I was going to try to be a copywriter. And I was taking copywriting classes. I was doing freelance copywriting that I could find like gigs on Craigslist. Again, Craigslist, really a good thing in the early aughts. And this probably would have worked. I think it was a pretty good plan, except that it was 2008. And so instead of getting a job in copywriting, what happened was the economy imploded and I became unemployed for a very long time. So at that point, I started, or rather continued to freelance. I managed to get a gig as a blogger at MTV News Hollywood Crush, which was the young Hollywood gossip blog. We wrote about basically nothing but Twilight for 3 years. And I got paid $15 a post to do that job, but I was working at MTV. And so when they decided to shutter their blogs in, I want to say it was like might have been 2012 or 2013. They shuttered the blogs. They took two people who had been bloggers over to MTV News as reporters, and I was one of them. So that was my big break into journalism. And from there, really around 2016, when suddenly all culture was also politics and pop culture was politics, which had a lot to do with the fact that Donald Trump was running for president. Suddenly my position as an entertainment writer and somebody who was writing about like gossip and actors and and the Twilight movies, suddenly I was also writing political stuff. I was hired by Us Weekly, which is one of those tabloid magazines you see in the supermarket, or you used to live blog the entire 2016 election every time they had an event. And so that was my entry into political writing. And so since then, it's just been kind of saying yes to weird things like that. And I've managed to build something sort of like a career. That was as short as I could make it, which I realized was also very, very long. Anyway, that's my journey.
First of all, I don't think this was long or completed in any way. It just seems like you are at the cusp, not just generationally, but between entertainment and politics, between the MTV generation and the millennials. I mean, I also spent some time of my life on like the online version of MTV, which was this hybrid of MTV trying to survive into the next generation, and MTV having a blog is already this weird mutation, right? Whereas obviously MTV in the 80s was an end in itself. So I definitely remember that. I'm really curious, and we will soon kind of segue into the main part of the conversation. But for just my selfish purposes, I'm so curious about your fiction writing and how being so up close to trends in politics and entertainment today, on what's happening on Twitter. Does this inform your fiction? Is it easier or more difficult to write fiction when you're so kind of viscerally in touch with the day-to-day kind of moments of culture?
I love this. I love this question because I think that these two parts of my life as a writer are completely in conversation with each other. And I think in many ways, when I write fiction, I'm doing the same thing that I am, or rather, I'm asking the same questions as I am as a journalist. I'm very interested in how we treat each other. And that's sort of what culture is. It's like, what is the air we breathe? How do we relate to each other? What's the context in which we understand each other as people? And what do we do to each other as a result? So when I'm working on a culture essay, or if I'm reporting a piece, that's the question that I'm trying to answer in the context of how does this look in the world? What is true about the world? And what are we doing to each other in real life, in reality, and why? And then when I'm writing a novel, here's a world of my own creation where I'm exploring all of these same questions and all of these same dynamics. And all of the stuff that fascinates me as a journalist, which is like, the questions of identity, how we present ourselves in different spheres, and how maybe this idea of you as a person can crystallize, even if it's something very distant from who you are. Questions of how do we date? How do we marry? How do we make friends? How do we make love? All of this stuff is very interesting to me as a journalist, but then when I am working on a novel, the same questions end up worming their way into the themes. They're not on the page quite as explicitly. I'm not explaining things prescriptively, which I don't really like to do as a culture writer either. But it's a chance to play, you know, to kind of like unweave that fabric and then put together something completely new.
I love this. Michael Nelson, the physicist, has this theory that everybody in their life only has one question. And so at some point when you're young, this question formulates in you, and you spend your entire life through, various stages of your education, you're kind of coming into being a full person. Everything is trying to find the answer to that question. And so when you look at convoluted stories or, very diverse careers, artistic careers, cultural careers, nomadic people moving around, underneath there might be just one question. And I don't know mine. I know it's there, but I've never been able to kind of articulate it. And I'm curious whether I would do myself a disservice if I were to translate it to human language or expressible, an expressible phrase, or we should just keep this kind of source code where running in the background. And if it's not doing too much trouble, we should just continue to kind of enjoy the fruits that comes out of our inquiry. Vivek, you made a face. Does this resonate?
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing to just have one question, that the idea of even following that, especially in this context, was really interesting. I need to go and read more about that.
So the question of what is your question, your underlying theme? It's interesting to imagine zooming out in that way, not just as a writer, but as a human being living life. It made me think of how supposedly there are 7 plots, like in total there are 7 storylines in
The Men
fiction.
in the Hole climb that's that list.
I can't remember. It's like the hero's journey. There's the I would have to I could go off and Google them in another window, and then I'd sit here like making weird faces. All of you guys watched me do that. But basically, like if you read books on like the art of story, you'll find people saying that there are 7 archetypal plots, or some people think that there are 12. But then I've also heard that actually there's only one, and it is, who am I? It's the search for self-conception, self-understanding. And I always liked that because I think it kind of dispenses with the question of like trying to figure out what is it that's driving you, because maybe it's just that and you can get rid of it and let it run in the background like you were saying, because it's the least interesting thing to think about head on in that way. And the interesting way to think about it is by not thinking about it and rather trying to observe in the world what you're seeing and to understand what it means. There's this quote by Joan Didion that's what she writes, to understand what she sees and what it means. And I think that is, I'm definitely no Joan Didion, but it is what I would like to strive for when it comes to what I'm accomplishing and what I'm doing for myself as a writer, and then also hopefully for the people who read me.
I think you are succeeding. I wasn't, I never really picked up on this beautiful kind of contractualist question, how do we treat each other? But absolutely we can see that in your work. And also this picking up on sometimes the ridiculousness of people overdoing the seriousness. I feel like there is, in your writing, there is this questioning of people who take themselves too seriously, to kind of poke at it a little bit.
Right. Well, it's interesting because there's I think I've always been an irreverent person, which was a different thing when I was a teenager, and also that was like a different culture when I was a teenager. So when I was young, it was like poking fun at people who were extremely usually like evangelical Christian, and who took that very, very seriously, you know, who would get upset at you if you were like, you know, you took the Lord's name in vain, or if there was sex on television, or if their children were listening to secular music. And it was like, you know, there was this panic about, it was very purity obsessed. And that was easy to kind of goof on because it is, you know, in certain ways goofy. But now I see that happening a lot. Kind of in my own house politically. I think that we are in this moment where people do imagine that kind of everything is the end of the world in a way that feels in some ways very adolescent. And that's, I mean, it's, you know, it's something that I want to have compassion for and that I think is interesting, but that also I think does sometimes deserve to be poked at a little bit, because in the end, you know, when people are doing something like this, what they're revealing is something not really about the world, but about what's happening inside of them. It's like they'll want what they want. And then what they do is they make up a story about why they want it and why it's morally good and just and like righteous that they want it.
Absolutely. I mean, I made a terrible mistake by not being on Twitter for 4 hours today. And in that period of time, Ayla blew up the internet. And I went on Twitter and I had to read like 700 tweets about what happened. You're trying to.
Oh, is this the gangbang?
Yeah, but I mean, it's like, imagine being mad that somebody who does orgies did an orgy. It's like, to
Yeah.
whom did it come as completely new, shocking information? And also, there are so many things. Like, read other people's tweets if you don't like this one, no?
Yeah, I mean, I just thought that when I saw not even necessarily her post about it, but all of the responses to it, I was like, all of these people are characters in a novel right now.
I want to read a novel by you where there's a fictional Ayla doing things. I think that would be, she needs to be fictionalized. But maybe it's hard to fictionalize somebody so unique, right? Because
Mhm.
where is the archetype that people would
Yeah,
identify with, right?
I think some of our biggest kind of digital personalities, and these people that we have these parasocial relationships with, it is so funny because if you were to write them as characters in a book and just include verbatim the stuff that they say, the stuff that they post, your editor would come back and be like, dude, dial it back. This is completely unbelievable. You need to make this at least sound a little bit real.
I love this. I mean, Aristotle himself says in his Poetics book that you shouldn't write the real, you should write the probable, because nobody
Mhm.
would believe real stuff. Like, that's always insane. Like Vivek, I think Vivek, you comment, you're the comedian in the group, so I will attribute this to you. I hope correctly that, you know, the person that Kat was describing with the gigantic East Village, you know, apartment on just being very good at Craigslist, right? And also inheriting a lot of money, I would imagine, and being on a trust fund sounds like a rom-com character. Because it's an archetype. But when somebody is a crazy, you know, a crazy outlier, the only thing you can do with them is to be a Walter Isaacson to them and try to make at least their own lives with their own name probable, and have people believe. But I'm going to stop before we move into the millennial mystery, because I know that many of you here are writers, and maybe you have comments and questions about journalism and being a millennial, or being a fiction and nonfiction writer at the same time. So I'm just going to pause for a moment and give you a chance to jump in. Meg, with the beautiful bookcase in the background.
Oh, thank you. Well, I just want to say thanks for putting on this salon, and Kat, I'm a huge fan. I love Feminine Chaos. I listen to it all the time. And also, You Must Remember This. Love that book. But and all your writing in Unheard and Everywhere. But yeah, I feel like I resonate with your work a lot. I'm also a millennial woman. I'm a freelance copywriter, and I am trying to make my way as a fiction novelist. I do have a book published with an indie publisher, but I'm in the process of trying to find a literary agent for my latest manuscript. But anyway, it's hard being a writer.
Can't be done.
Yeah, thanks. I'll try my best. But something that I like a lot in your writing is that I think you do a good job of often pointing out within contemporary trends that kind of the idea that there are no new ideas, like, oh, we're seeing this new trend, but at the same time, it's something that's happened and repeated throughout history. Like, for example, in your newer piece about how reading has sort of become performative and who is reading for anyway. And you started out with the photo of Marilyn Monroe reading Ulysses. And so I like how you often tend to point out that there's nothing new under the sun in some ways. There's just sort of like a new spin on it. So I guess as far as that relates to millennials and generational stuff, there's always these generational wars. There's always, Zoomers versus boomers. There's always some sort of dialogue about that. But I do feel like this sort of generational painting everyone of the same generation with this very broad brush and this sort of feuding between generations. I do feel like there's been an uptick in that recently for some reason. And I was wondering if you would agree with that sentiment or why you think this argument and these feuds might be coming to the surface now more than ever.
I think the internet has everything to do with it. I mean, that's sort of something that I think is the closest thing to a unifying theme in my work when it comes to the question of like how new is any of this. The answer is almost always that it's not new, except the internet. The internet takes whatever the existing dynamic was, and social media especially, and it just dials it up to 11. So it's like, I mean, there are, you can go back to ancient Greece and Rome and find the philosophers of the time writing these letters to each other, bewailing that the youth today are so disrespectful and they can't do anything and nobody wants to work hard anymore. And there's actually an amazing, I saw this on Twitter, somebody had compiled an amazing thread of headlines through the ages. And the unifying theme was nobody wants to work anymore, which is something you hear all the time. And you hear right now about Gen Z. They don't want to work. Nobody wants to work anymore. People have been saying literally this exact thing dating back as far as there has been, as long as there have been newspapers in this country, there has been somebody saying this in the news. So I think that when you talk about the generational warfare, the difference is that now the public square is visible to us at all times. We're all kind of in it all the time. People are making content about it all the time. So something that would have been a conversation like at, over a private dinner or in somebody's living room 30 years ago is now a video that's gone viral that everyone has seen and everyone is reacting to. So the conversation is not different, but its participants are much more numerous and the volume is a lot louder.
Thanks.
Anybody else has a question at this stage? Stefan?
I pass for now.
Okay. We're always here and you can always raise your hand if there's a question. I always try to avoid having somebody think of the best question ever and then only getting a chance to ask it 30 minutes later, and then for 30 minutes you're just like constipated with your question and you're not really listening. So just, if it happens, let it out. All right, so let's face the elephant in the room, which is what's going on with millennials? Was Gen X so kind of berated? I mean, I have some faint memories from childhood of like the movie Singles and then Friends. I don't know. Were they so vilified? What's going on with millennials? And is it because we invented social media? For which we might be going to hell collectively, by the way. And being in eternity in a place that's only millennials might actually be hell. So,
Definitely in the Sartrean sense of it, for sure. Yeah, I was just thinking, like, imagine it, like, hell, that is where you go, and every day it's just an endless feed of tweets about an orgy that somebody else attended.
It's
And
influencer moms and their juicer that does that.
so I think I was thinking about the question of Gen X and whether they were as reviled. I think the answer is actually yeah, they were. They had their Time magazine cover calling them like the slacker generation or Generation Me. They had the concept of the kidult, which was embodied in, I think, there was the movie Reality Bites. That I think is kind of like the ultimate Gen X. Which I mean, that was a little cuspy also because it's like, Winona Ryder, Ethan Hawke, but that did embody this notion of like, the slackers who are not growing up and they have no jobs and they're not achieving life milestones the way that they're supposed to be and so on and so forth. All these things that are said also about millennials. And I don't remember if it was for Gen X, they blamed video games, and for us, it was avocado toast. There's always some weird culprit that they decide has been like, the thing that is holding the generation back. The one thing about millennials that I do think is interesting is that I think, are, well, I was about to say something and then I just realized I don't think I agree with it. I was going to say that that we've piloted or pioneered this sort of desperate affinity for youth culture that we're no longer a part of, and now we're kind of clinging to the people who are coming up in the next generation. But I just remembered that like back in the 60s, Pauline Kael observed this same exact dynamic when it came to people who were like, I mean, then the boomers, I guess, were the youth, but older people were simultaneously kind of in thrall to youth, but also afraid of youth. So the cachet surrounding being young is not something that's new to millennials, although we may be fetishizing it in a slightly different performative way because of social media. But the one thing that I do think is maybe a little bit unique about us is that we have a different kind of nostalgic relationship with the culture that we came of age in, where we want to revisit it. We're at that point where things from the 90s are starting to be rebooted. All the fashion trends that I wore from the Delia's catalog in 1997 are back in Target right now, and people who are 25 years younger than me are wearing them, and that's crazy and depressing. But when it comes to things like the celebrity culture that we grew up in, where it was like tabloids and it was images of like normal sized thin female actresses and a headline that's like, look at the fat thighs on Jennifer Love Hewitt, like all of this stuff. It was very exploitive. It was the start. It was like the kind of pre-digital culture, but it was the start of this sense of like everybody being scrutinized, everybody being under a microscope, everybody being compelled to justify themselves in public just for how they looked or how they lived. And I think that we realize now that it wasn't really a great thing. And so we're trying to at once revisit that culture because we are nostalgic for it, but we're also mad at it. We feel like it shaped us in ways that turned us into punchlines, and now we're being laughed at, and we're not woke enough, but we're not unself-conscious enough to care that we're not woke. And it's so there's this kind of resentment towards the products of our youth, but we also want to revisit them. And so what we've started to do is we have started revisiting them from the perspective of the like the documentarian who's looking back and who's older and wiser now and is like, actually, this was really bad and it was really immoral. But as we do this, we're still getting to actually enjoy marinating in all of those same properties and all those same feelings all over again.
I love this, and I'm very much with you on this having to do something with our ambivalence, and not just the millennials' ambivalence with the 90s, but everybody's, right? That there's something there, a kind of fallen dream, or a dream that turns out to have been a travesty. I mean, the entirety of the Me Too movement, to me, I mean, I grew up in show business, you know, with a family in TV and film. And I used to work in films, film and TV, and you know, I in the 90s, hi Rasputin, in the 90s, you know, the Miramax movies were the shit, right? Like they were the heights of like American auteur cinema, and all the European filmmakers were trying to emulate or kind of, you know, prove them wrong or something. Like they had a relationship with that. And so, you know, the Me Too campaign that came from basically the first Weinstein testimonies was also, you know, a cultural awakening that these musicians, filmmakers we loved now turn out to have been either absolute woman beating heroin addicts, or actress raping mini dictators with a cat's tail on my screen. So it's very, very ambivalent. But one other thing that I'm thinking about is absolutely yes to this the tabloid celebrity thing that you would expect grandmothers to be reading about, like older actresses and their divorces, but instead it was teenagers. I mean, we were reading Bravo and stuff like that when I was in like middle school. And you know what Zuckerberg built in, and what, you know, we had in like 2005 to 2005, 7, that kind of until 2008, was basically creating tabloid stars out of ourselves as a way to take back control. Like you didn't only want to become a celebrity anymore. Like in the 80s, you wanted to be on MTV, and millennials were like, no, that's terrible. I want to write the caption for my photo, because I would not say I have fat thighs about myself. Do you think that there was something about taking back control there that then kind of let the genie out of the bottle?
Yes, absolutely. I think that sounded so good when it was just theoretical. We didn't know yet what it was going to unleash, because, you know, I mean, there's something to be said, of course, for having control of your own narrative until you get to the point where the narrative you've chosen controls you. And yeah, you know, it's interesting when you mention, you know, the Me Too movement. It was such a tenet of that, you know, we were at once condemning what was going on in years past. We're saying we look back now and we realize that was bad. But what are we doing? We're gawking at it. We're, you know, reading lascivious story after lascivious story about some nubile young starlet in a room, you know, with a man in a, you know, in a bad bathrobe that he's gonna throw open, and then he's gonna chase her around, and bad things are gonna happen. So it's like, it's the same train wreck with, and the same kind of impulse to gape at it and to be like, ooh, like that's disgusting, I bet someone died, like, you know, I mean, it's the kind of the gawking, but we're doing it with the veneer of moral superiority now. The other thing that's interesting to me when you mentioned Facebook and social media, like Facebook was the original kind of iteration of this, that, you know, it created the culture that we're now all still swimming in, even though Facebook itself has transformed into something else. But when Facebook initially launched, it was something that Mark Zuckerberg had created because he wanted to like compare how hot the different girls in his class were. Like at that time, the entire point was to basically treat normal human beings like celebrities, but without giving them the option of controlling their own narratives. It was, we're going to decide who you are. We're going to assign value to you in the same way we assign value to like this starlet or this model, you know, based on how sexy you are to me a nerd.
Is that a cat purring, by the way?
It is. Oh God, is he? Can you hear him?
I
I'm
can
so
hear
sorry.
it, and it's the sweetest sound. I'm in a hotel. I wish the cat was here. That's amazing. Vivek, you have your hand up. It's
Yeah.
hilarious, and it's so much louder in the mic. I think probably
Oh,
it's
buddy.
close to your computer. No, please leave it on. I love it. This is perfect. We are not just an intergenerational platform, but also interspecies. So global, intergenerational, and interspecies. Annie Pat, welcome. Vivek, the floor is yours.
Oh yeah. So first of all, thanks for having this salon. This is awesome. I've been following your work for a long time, Kat. Great to be here with you. On this particular point of, so I was just reading your, how the 90s are haunting millennials piece. And, it's basically the point that you just made, this idea of, I'm just going to quote from the piece, but you say, but if like the former 90s kids who still engage in this mode of cultural critique are like the murderer who gets off on reliving his crime through confession, almost as much as he got off on the killing himself. There's an almost giddy subtext to the whole thing where we were so bad. Like, but of course, we're also better now. We're obsessed with the same scandals, but for morally superior reasons. This not only absolves us of our complicity in the raunch mischief of yore, but also conveniently aligns with the sentiments of the upcoming generation Zoomers, who are displacing us as the society's youngest adults, whether we want to grow up or not. So this seems so rich and so interesting to me, but I'm not quite convinced that. So first of all, let's say we did look back and we were consuming this lurid and the same content we might have in a rag in the 60s or the 50s or the 80s or whatever, but we're looking at it from a morally superior stance. I think, I don't know, I maybe that's a cynic. I feel like that's a cynical way to look at it. Maybe we are better. I do think there's a moral, to give the whatever the saying is, the devil his due. I think, isn't that true? I mean, we should. Isn't it better to look at what happened in the 90s and not think that we're better, but at least think that what happened then, if it's not happening now, it would be a better thing for it not to happen. Isn't it just how moral intuitions evolve? And isn't there like I could see the moral puritanism of that really taking over into its excesses, which you've written a lot about. But isn't that a fundamentally natural and good thing?
Oh, I mean, I think that it's certainly natural. And I mean, so I'm of two minds about this, because on the one hand, I agree with you. There are ways in which objectively we can point at the way that we understand the world now as versus the way we understood the world in the 90s. I'm thinking about the way that somebody would be when I was in high school, the way that people would be gay bashed in a way that they're not now. And it's great that we don't do that anymore. But I think at the same time, there is this impulse to imagine that progress is just this straight line, and whatever evolution takes place is necessarily good. And what I'm thinking of right now is the way that female characters in books and film, and particularly actually in Disney movies, which is something that I recently wrote about, the way that we present these characters now to be kind of in keeping with feminist principles has paradoxically stripped a lot of the complexity out of the kind of archetype of what a woman can be. Like the fullness of how women can be has been increasingly kind of pushed to the side, either because it's considered offensive or hackneyed or stereotypical. But the result is not better characters. It's female characters who are quote unquote strong, but their strength is that they're basically more like men. They're tough, they're like physically powerful. They try to solve their problems by punching things. They're
I
uninterested
do that too.
I mean, it can be a solution. But when I look at like the difference between the trope of the self-saving princess, which is kind of the big thing right now, and the way that these characters were constructed in previous times when there was a sort of an understanding that they couldn't, like Cinderella wasn't going to punch her way out of her situation. She was inherently powerless, and so she found strength in being decent, in being kind, and in having kind of faith that these things would eventually improve her outcome, or if they didn't, they would be their own reward. Now, that's an old-fashioned notion, but is it worse than if she had punched her stepmother in the face and like jumped out a window and ridden off into the sunset like a hero? I don't know. So I think that there is like this impulse to say that everything that happened before, say, 1996 is unenlightened and hence bad, and what we're producing now is enlightened and hence good. But if you compare the reboots of these movies that we are trying to revisit, we're trying to like eat our cake and have it with things like Ghostbusters. It's like, oh, I love Ghostbusters, but the former one was a sausage party, so let's remake it with all women. Okay, well, PS, the new Ghostbusters was terrible. It was objectively an absolutely atrocious movie. So, did it inculcate the proper values? I guess arguably. Was it a better piece of art? Absolutely not. And so that's sort of what I think about when you talk about improving on the past.
I mean, I have young kids in my family and sometimes watch these new Disney movies with them where it's just basically asexual, right? Like there's a woman in the center or a female character, but she's not really a woman, right? Because your gender becomes apparent in comparison with somebody from a different gender, right? Like we have to be contrasted to try different things, and some of those things will not be good, right? Like masculinity can be embodied in positive and negative ways, but if you only leave men alone together, a lot of those games will be just kind of running around in a circle. And so I'm a little bit with Jordan Peterson on this, like pre-crazy Jordan Peterson, the old lectures before he became famous. Nobody's ever improved by fame. Principle applies. That like you can't change the archetypes, right? You can give people journeys and incredibly noble, heroic journeys, but you can't use human beings either between genders or generations or even cultures where you just kind of transpose like the archetypes one on the other, because it's not going to work. I mean, Campbell in less PC texts does write about the fact that the hero's journey is just different for women. Like we have a different life cycle and different considerations, and they may be different temperaments, and it doesn't make you less worthy in any way. If anything, you might be doing two heroic journeys at the same time, which many, many women do. But just one thing I really want to add here, because I feel like we keep forgetting that the whole lean in thing, the girl boss that now all the treadwives are debunking on TikTok, was a boomer thing. I mean, or Gen X. I mean, it came from Sheryl Sandberg. Like she did work with a millennial, but lean in did not emanate from the millennial psyche. It was kind of a passed down from your cool boss, like in the Amy Schumer movie where like Tilda Swinton is this cool boss who like She's like, I had that boss. Like I had when I was an intern, my boss was like 10 years older. I think that makes her a Gen X. And that's where we got a lot of this stuff from. I don't think millennial women were like, this is not really working out for me, you know? And if you remember Sheryl Sandberg's TED Talk, she does talk about this employee, right? I mean, the whole thing is like, looking back, the whole thing is insanely weird. She talks about this Facebook employee female who's like younger and at the beginning of her career, which because this, I think the TED Talk was in like 2010, this must be a millennial woman, right? A young millennial woman who wants to have kids and a family. And Cheryl is like, no, but she has 2 kids. So you kind of don't understand. And I think even at the time, you know, this was kind of externally imposed on millennial women. And so to kind of blame us for the whole girl boss movement is, I don't know. What do you guys think about that? Do you remember this TED Talk? Do you remember Sheryl Sandberg's TED Talk? Yeah. Okay. I mean, she's brilliant. I mean, a business savvy, you know, in high heels. That's amazing. But like this particular parable that she shares is a little bit sus, as the kids would say.
Well, I have a, let's say, more general question. I would like to pick up on Anna's reference to Gen X. So I'm a Gen X member, and I wonder how the millennials think about us, especially in the context of 3, let's say, broader, let's say, narratives that we created, and whether we are just a little naive and sometimes a little bit ridiculous. So after the end of the Cold War and communism, we thought, let's say, democracy is unstoppable. We thought that free trade will create peace and democracy everywhere, and the internet will facilitate a almost Habermasian non-dominion discourse. And none of those, let's say, bigger narratives really have borne out. So I'm just curious, how are, let's say, millennials looking at my generation, especially in the context of those false narratives?
It's basically, if I understand, just to add a footnote to this is basically, which is also one of my main questions for tonight, which is, are millennials so talked about because this is the first generation in a very long time in Western history for whom it might be going worse in many like ways, if you translate everything to the actual context. And the other thing that really worries me is, are we the last great generation in size? Because if we assume that the fertility rates might stabilize but will never rise again unless there is a really, really drastic change in society, then we might be the last truly populous generation in the West. And I don't know if that's good news. If we take over and are we going to become the next boomers? You know, we're the greatest. Yeah, Vivek is commenting in the chat. That's no question.
I mean, I think about the declining fertility thing all the time from the perspective of, you know, what is going to happen when we're all old and there is not enough young people to take care of us. I'm reserving my spot under the bridge now where I will eat cat food until I die. That's the plan. I mean, it's interesting to think about Gen X because I think mostly we don't really think about Gen X. I mean, I hate to say this, but like you guys are
I'm not offended. That's okay.
Like every time I see an infographic, like I can't remember the number of times that Gen X is just left out. It'll say like boomers, and then it'll say millennials, and then it'll say Gen Z, and it's like you guys don't exist.
It's such an important generation. I mean, they are sitting in all the, look at Stefan, they are sitting in all the good seats.
Yeah. Well, and also, I mean, they created the culture that we are in right now. I mean, like all of the most dominant stuff. I'm thinking specifically like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, you know, that's Gen X nerds having come into power and reshaped the culture, reshaped Hollywood in the image of what they wanted to see. I don't know if I have anything else more insightful than that to say about it. Like,
The Gen X
except that,
mystery. I mean, that's why they are X. I mean, it's in their name. You can never know them.
but what I am
Well,
thinking about is how, you know, none of us are actually responsible for shaping the culture in which we participate. So the Zoomers are, you know, as bonkers as they're acting and as crazy as TikTok is, like they didn't do that to themselves. Like they're responding to the miasma that I guess millennials really kind of created. And millennials, for all that we were griped about when we were in our 20s, were responding to an environment created by, I guess probably created more by boomers, but also a little bit by, I mean, our bosses, assuming we were working for people like not grossly older than us, were likely to be Gen X. And I'm just thinking about, this is like a little bit galaxy brained, but a lot of Gen X they were kind of the latchkey kid generation. I think that Gen X was the last generation in which resilience was seen as a positive thing, and in which like actively inculcating resilience was seen as a necessary thing. And paradoxically, my experience working for Gen X bosses was that they had no faith in me to do anything on my own. And I had like, I mean, I had a crazy boss who, when I first started working in publicity, who was like, she would not let me talk to anybody who was a rung above me in in the hierarchy, and especially not to authors or to clients or producers or anybody who was important. And it was like, if I was going to be on the phone with somebody, I was given a script and I was told, like, ask this question, say it exactly like this, and then get off the phone before you ruin everything. And I was like, what's going to happen? Like, what's going to happen? Because I've been working since I was 14, but not in corporate jobs, obviously. And so what I decided was that this adult who had been in the working world, in the adult corporate world, for 10 years longer than I had, must know something I didn't, and like everything I knew must be wrong. And so I became very, very nervous. Like, I didn't used to have phone anxiety, but I sure as hell had it when I left that job. And then I went to work at another company where my boss was a young boomer. And I will never forget, she asked me to make a phone call, and I was like, I had like PTSD from this previous job. And I was like, okay, how exactly do you want me to do that? And she looked at me like I had just asked her to wipe my ass. It was incredible. But I was like, I didn't do this to me. My Gen X boss did this to me.
And it's hereditary, right? Like, I feel like I'm kind of a Gen X boss with my team. I mean, I have 12 people on the Interintellect team, and I am much more like my Gen X bosses. And they are sometimes very Gen Z. And they are like, for me, going to, I don't know, I was 19 and an intern at this TV station, it was a social, opportunity. I mean, I walked in and there were like 120 people. I was going to meet some of the coolest people I had ever met, definitely more interesting conversations than I would have with my university class, who could only talk about Socrates, which is very interesting, but like not every day, all the time. And it was like jumping into this social pool. And I see, Gen Z people coming to work, even if it's remote, and for them coming to work is a social sacrifice, because they are talking to hundreds and hundreds of people all the time, every day, or at least looking at them and having the kind of dopamine kick socially. And then coming to work means that, okay, now you're on the Slack, and on the Slack, it will be by default fewer people on the Interintellect Slack, even on the Interintellect Discord in the community, than what you get on TikTok. And it took me a lot of time to understand that we have this generation now who is completely internet native, and for whom any restriction is a sacrifice. No, yeah, I'm sorry, Agnes Collard would not like that I said that, I'm sorry, but I'm, I come from a different part of philosophy, so I'm sure she will forgive. She's doing a salon with me on forgiveness on the 10th of April, so she must. Yeah, okay, 2 people have their hands up. Maybe I said something that really resonates, or it's a coincidence. I don't know. We'll see. Eli, go. Mexico City, right?
Guadalajara, Mexico's second biggest city.
Okay. Sorry, I don't know why I remember you were. Oh, because a lot of other Interintellects are in Mexico City. Sorry.
Right. And there was an IRL from Interintellect in Mexico City, which I went, which is great. But okay, so Kat, I'm a fan of your cultural criticism, especially the one on Reason. Cultural critics have been a big influence in my life, like Virginia Postrel, former editor at Reason. She was such a big influence in my life. One of the reasons I dropped out of math. But anyway, I wanted to ask you about how you transitioned from journalism to fiction. So you talked about how you got into journalism, right? And you said something really interesting about, I really like your deconstruction of how the self-saving princess trope. So I wonder how you approach that in your fiction. Like, how I'm very interested. I honestly don't know if I'm going to be able to read your fiction, because thrillers scare me, basically. So, but I would just like to know how you approach that in your fiction, because the protagonists are women.
And women
right?
always write scarier stuff. Women write the truly scary stuff.
I think that is true. I think women do have a gift for, well, I mean, especially if you're talking about sort of social horror or domestic horror, because we know what that's like. So I'm trying to think about this. I mean, I hate the term strong female character. It's become a sort of a cliche and a much mocked one for a reason. But when I'm working on a story, when I'm working on fiction, my main concern is complexity and, to get at something that feels truthful. And that usually is not, I mean, if you have a woman saving herself, it's probably not going to be a feel-good story. I think, one of the things that I like about being able to write fiction and being able to kind of play with characters in fiction is that it's a great place to explore in all its contours the so-called radical notion that women are people. And I frequently end up writing about women who are doing things that are not very nice, who are fully autonomous, who are, who have agency, and who are using that agency to make really bad choices that they then have to reckon with, which is something that, I mean, I don't like to think of myself as reactionary in terms of how I write, but I think that that's something about the narratives about women that we have culturally right now that does bother me. And so maybe subconsciously I'm trying to kind of push back against that.
I think Caitlin Flanagan had this really interesting kind of counter point to the Aziz Ansari scandal when that happened. Scandal. I don't know what the right term for it. Expose. That for her generation, as kind of post-60s boomer, basically, like somebody who was not an adult during, because it's also like boomers, like my mom and my dad are both boomers, but their kind of social experience and artistic and aesthetic experience or historical experience, it was completely different. And if you were born in the 40s, you're a boomer, late 40s, right? But anyway, that for her generation, or Caitlin Flanagan's generation, the liberation of women meant that you could risk being in a situation like this woman who had this terrible experience with Aziz Ansari was in, and that for her, being able to make mistakes was a breakthrough experience. And I think this is why I am so concerned when it comes to intra-generational and intergender polarization, when we stop being able not just to talk with each other, but we start speaking completely different languages with a different kind of semiotic map, completely different terms meaning completely different things, or one thing meaning two completely different things. Because how else are we going to learn? Like, I want to learn from Caitlin Flanagan and feel the part of me wake up that wants this risk, because the alternative is, let's be frank, is worse, right? Like, there was a reason why that change happened. Like, Chesterton's fence is standing there for a reason. But I want her generation to also learn from me and be like, okay, but if I have taken the risk and it led to something where I'm seriously entertaining the idea that my consent was not in any way at play in this situation, or even asked for, you know, I don't want to be blamed and say like, oh, well, you went to his apartment. And I feel like so many of these cultural discussions here, I mean, half of my Twitter is women much younger than me being like, I just want children. And this is somehow a transgressive act at wherever I am in college. We had a wonderful salon with Deborah Baum, whose book on marriage I really would prescribe for everybody. And I didn't know, and she told me that in her circles in London, like filmmakers, writers, academics, like, you know, intelligentsia, she's sometimes shamed for being married and having 2 kids. I never knew, I never heard this angle. That as a Gen X woman, born, I think, in 75, so not so, you know, far away from us, she has to defend the, like, I didn't know that her kind of people, I don't want to overgeneralize, can be, like, ask for an explanation, like, why did you surrender? And I don't know if going so much to the extreme and just for every generation to just have something to shame each other about is constructive in a way. I want to learn. I don't know. And so I'm curious whether we think that, you know, millennials maybe calming down a little bit and becoming a little bit middle-aged, you know, maybe are we becoming a little bit more open to both learning from older people and maybe teaching younger people? Will they listen to us?
Oh man, I had so many thoughts as you were speaking. And so I think that maybe this is something that is sort of unique to millennials when it comes to the stories that we tell about ourselves. I think that we are the generation that experienced the pivot in terms of the kind of self-narrative that we construct, where it used to be that you wanted to be the hero of your own story. And we really experienced the shift to wanting to be the victim of your story, where that's sort of how you gain capital. It's how you get, I mean, in the kind of world of social media, it's how you get clout, it's how you get sympathy, it's how you get attention, by being...
Sorry to interject, but is that a post-Me Too thing, or is that the other way around, something that led to Me Too? How do you see the kind of causal relationship?
I think it led to Me Too. I think that you can actually date this back to the popularization of the idea of date rape as a form of sexual assault. Because that was the first time that the idea kind of entered the zeitgeist that women can't be expected to play by the same social rules or operate within the same kind of social conventions as everybody else when it comes to being fully responsible for the choices you make. That if you're a woman and somebody pressures you to say yes to sex, and you say yes because you feel pressured, that in some way negates your agency, like you didn't really make that decision. And I think so. Oh God, a couple of things. All right, so one is that once that happened, I do think we developed a little bit of an allergy to the idea of making mistakes that you then learn from. Because if you're imagining that, I mean, you imagine now that you're not capable of making mistakes. You can only be pushed into doing something bad for you. You can never make a bad choice. So then there's nothing to learn from, right? Like if you have, you know, if you've been victimized, you have no responsibility there. There's nothing that you can, you know, that you can take away from that. So that I think is part of it. And now I've managed to get lost in the weeds of my own mind, and I can't remember what I was going to say after this.
I think that's very, very salient. And but I remember, like, okay, The Rules of Attraction, like Bret Easton Ellis's book. Well, maybe not his best book, because he wrote his best book when he was 18 for some reason, to make us all feel really unproductive. I mean, the Gen X writer. And The Rules of Attraction starts with the main female character being raped, drunk out of her mind at the freshman party at this elite college in America. And that's how she loses her virginity. And in the middle of this sexual act, the guy throws up on her back because she's pushed down, face down on the bed. And it was like an iconic scene in Gen X. So I think for millennial women, it's like, I mean, the whole book is about her being super traumatized and basically descending into this kind of Stefan Zweig level hell. But it would have been a very different book for millennial. And I a couple of days ago I watched the Alanis Morissette documentary that she hates. And I don't have anybody has seen this the HBO documentary that she then disavowed.
Who is this?
Alanis Morissette.
Oh, okay. I haven't seen it.
So there's, from 2 years ago, there is this documentary about her, her early career. And it's like, I think Kat, you would absolutely love it. So here's the Gen X woman, right? Who wrote You Oughta Know, and who is famous for having been basically statutory raped when she was 15 by this guy, and she wrote songs about this person, etc., etc. And there's the millennial filmmaker who's trying to edit her into a millennial victim story. And so you have Alanis, who is like talking in her own way about what happened to her, and then it's cut with this really weird music and this like weird, really emotionally manipulative way. And when I watched it, I understood why she disowned it. But you learn this difference between, you know, an Alanis Morissette saying all these really shitty things happened to me because I didn't know better, and because these people were shitty and they exploited me. And so I worked a lot on myself and I went into therapy, and now I have these 3 kids and this husband, and, you know, I'm healing, I'm working on it. And then you have the millennial woman who seems to be framing this as this, like, you have been branded forever. And you have been like almost like a Victorian, like you're a fallen woman now, like La Traviata, like you're done, honey, you're going down the toilet. And I keep thinking about this. I don't feel this, so I think I may be not fully millennial, but it's there in the narrative, you know, that you slip once because somebody pushes you, it's not your fault, and then goodbye. It's the same as cancellation, right? Like it's just one stroke.
Yeah, I think that we have replaced the notion of the fallen woman with the notion of the traumatized one, but it serves the same purpose.
Vivek, you had your hand up? No? Tell me, what did you want to say?
Oh yeah. Yeah, sorry, I had a bunch of thoughts that I was thinking. Yeah, I try to write them down so I wouldn't forget. One was just this idea of the, you know, Gen X, and to pick up on this idea of resilience, right? I think that, yeah, Gen X is probably maybe the last generation where resilience was almost universally valued, across gender perhaps, but certainly as a cultural value. But I wonder if that's gone hand in hand with the necessary, you know, march through the ages into greater honesty in emotional expression, at least for dudes, you know, like the stiff upper lip ultimately becoming, you know, somebody, I don't know, crying on TikTok. right, from the 50s all the way to now. I wonder if that relates to resilience. In a very conservative telling of the story, a reactionary might say, hey, you know what? That's the problem. Resilience has to go with restraint in expression of all kinds. And I don't quite buy into that, but that just felt like a salient, both those things going together. Like we've become less and less resilient. I don't think they're causally related, but I do think that the emotional expression, generally femininity, like understanding that this feminine that has been held back within men, especially, like that, the energy of that, like has to be integrated, right? And I think we're probably in the process of that. So that was one thing that came to mind. Another was like just this idea of like writing about, Kat, you mentioned this idea of writing about, I hate the word, but problematic women, but like essentially like women doing things that may be unsavory or things like that. I think the reaction to Gone Girl, I mentioned in the comments, was like very interesting to me among progressives, because there was this intermingling of fiction with stereotype. Oh, fiction is now a thing that does real world things. Like you show a woman doing this, you're playing into stereotypes that have existed from the Salem witch trials. Oh my God, this is so bad. I wonder if you had to grapple with that when you were writing, and what your thoughts are on this intersection of stereotype and this idea of feeding into stereotypes generally, right? Like and how that comes into play with reclaiming narrative. And then finally, the third point I had was like this: we were talking about victimhood, right? I think I just want to say that sometimes there's this idea of victimhood is totally bad, but there is such thing as victimhood as an identity versus victimhood as an observation. Sometimes observing that you have indeed been a victim of something, whether you identify with the category of victim, but identifying that you might have been a victim of something can be an act of responsibility. And actually, it might be hard to, in fact, a thing that often holds us back from facing really painful things in our lives might be that we don't want to see ourselves that way. So to actually see that, oh, actually, this has happened, that actually could coexist with the idea that that is an act of ownership, actually. Anyway, those are just any thoughts would be super welcome on any of those points.
Maybe a slightly, let's say, more philosophical digression. So I think there is some inherent paradox, let's say, that I've observed over the last few years. So we have, on one hand, a resurgence of essentialism. So you are a victim, you are born a victim. There are also other narratives, but it's very essentialist. You cannot escape your essentialist identity. On the other hand, we still have let's say, a post-structuralist world where everything is fluid. You can create yourself in any way all the time. So something like identity doesn't actually, let's exist and shouldn't exist, because you can create it all the time, you can deconstruct it, and you can start from scratch. Both narratives exist at the time, and they don't fit together. It's a paradox. And you have to be very careful, depending on your audience, on which feet you are stepping, because either you are on the essentialist track or you are on a deconstructive post-structuralist track. And that, I think, is something that is, I have, as probably one of the oldest people here on this call, I haven't experienced in the 80s, in the 90s. That's, it's really something, let's say, very recent. And I don't have a very good explanation for it.
This also resonates with what we did a salon on Tar, the movie with Kate Blanchett about the conductor, and we read this text by Zadie Smith, who actually is very good friends with Deborah Baum, who wrote read this piece if you can, called The Instrumentalist, about the movie. And there's this one section in the it talks a lot about this Gen X millennial clash, actually, about like, am I the captain of my fate, or am I a person to whom things happen and then they brand me and I live with the results of not my actions but the results of other people's actions on me. And she says this thing where she says that the internet killed the ad hominem, because the internet makes the consumer forget that people have multiple ideas and you become your opinion. And so you can no longer use an ad hominem defense of yourself saying, I just had this tweet from 20 years ago where I said that because I was on Ambien on the toilet or whatever, but that's you. Your opinion is you. And I think that, I think we have this opinion essentialism, maybe even more than identity essentialism. That's why people are so scared of saying anything. I mean, not Kat, thankfully, but you say one wrong thing and you're done. I mean, if you let it happen, right? But is that a millennial thing? And it actually takes me back to my earlier question. Like, Kat, do you agree with the thesis that millennials are the first generation in a long period of time that is worse off than our parents were, or less hopeful? Maybe those are two different things and I'm mixing them up.
Yeah, so this is interesting because there's this self-narrativizing aspect to it. Like, data-wise, if you look at how millennials are doing, how much money we're making, we're actually doing okay. Apparently the myth of the underachieving millennial, like who can't get married or buy a home or save for retirement, like that's actually not really, it doesn't really track with reality. But we have been telling that story about ourselves for a really long time. And I do think that there's something to be said for the notion that we are uniquely put upon, that we've faced challenges that are deeply unfair, that no other generation has had to tackle. There's solace to be found in that. And I was thinking about this from the perspective of what Vivek was saying about whether there's something brave or resilient to be found in understanding oneself to have been a victim. And I think that it can kind of go both ways, because on the one hand, identifying as a victim can represent a retreat, like a phobic retreat from the reality that the world is chaotic and out of our control for the most part. And so you can kind of be like, well, I've been victimized, like there's nothing I can do. So I'm just gonna curl into a ball and I'm gonna cry and everyone should feel bad for me. But there's also, I've been victimized. There was nothing I could have done. Like it was out of my control. And that can be kind of empowering, insofar as it allows you to accept the limits of your influence, which is, they're that's like not a big sphere of what you can actually exert control over. And then it gives you a path forward to say, well, I'm gonna do, it's a serenity prayer, right? It's like, I'm gonna accept what I can't control, make peace with what I can't control, and then work on the stuff that I can.
What did you think about, we had a salon about how Barbie is not really about women, it's about millennial women, like it's the millennial woman movie. First of all, would you agree with that? And what did you think about the deprogramming scene? There's this famous scene in Barbie, if you guys haven't seen it, I'm not spoiling the story whatsoever, where a lot of the Barbies become like these slave girls to these there's a revolt of the Kens when they become like overly masculine in some weird caricature way. And then these girls start like just bringing them, the beer and being very, very obedient. And then the good Barbie goes and basically has to like deprogram them. And then they wake up. Kat, I'm sure you've seen a movie. What did you think about this scene?
I saw Barbie twice, not either time by choice. So Yeah, I had two separate groups of friends who I promised both that I would see it with them, and then they wanted to go on different days, and I was like, I guess I'm seeing Barbie 2 days in a row. So yeah, I felt like I took
My
something different away.
sympathies, my sympathies. Talk about the woman as victim.
Thank you, seriously. So I found that part of the Barbie movie very frustrating because it did this thing of sort of equating toxic masculinity with some stuff that was annoying, but also some stuff that is just like objectively great cultural products. It was like, you know, toxic masculinity is liking The Godfather. It's like, I love The Godfather. What the hell? So I mean, I do think that there's something, yeah, you know, the scene where America Ferrera, who is an escapee from the real world, she's just like a mom, and she manages to make her way into Barbie world, and then she goes on this rant that's supposed to embody like the eternal frustrations and the way that millennial women can't win because you're being expected to do everything. People in the theater, the first night that I saw that, I was at an art house theater, and the audience was mostly women my age and older. There was spontaneous applause, and me and the women I was with looked around and were like, seriously? Like, we are actually yas queening for this? Okay. And then the next time I saw it, the audience was mostly like women in their early 20s and teenage girls. And that line, that scene, it went over like a lead balloon. It was fascinating. There was like no reaction. All they wanted was Ken dancing. And I kind of don't blame them. So there's definitely something about that yes, speaks to the particular kind of gripes of millennial women about our place in society. But I thought it was, for that reason, kind of pandering. I think it was basically like, yes, you have, honey, you have been victimized, and none of it was your fault, and there was nothing you could do. But I don't think that it was like in the positive way. I don't think that was like a positive, empowering reinforcement. I think it was like yes, so put your tail between your legs, like you never could have expected to achieve anything kind of way.
Yeah, and it was, I mean, I found the movie strangely anti-man, like much more than I would have expected from the wife of Noah Baumbach, who's like happily married and clearly they are doing fine. You know, the husband of the America Ferrera character was this like NPC who's just like trying to Duolingo in the background. You know, it was anyway. Also, that the fact that Barbie doesn't want to sleep with Ken, and that's just never explored.
Yes. Oh God. I mean, the
Then
idea
why?
that women have no
Then why are you
desire.
dating?
Yes. No, the idea that women have no desire is like, that is one of my biggest bugaboos about the culture right now. It's like this kind of neutered vision of women and of womanhood. And I think it is very interesting that in the Barbie movie, she like apparently she gets a vagina, and what does she do? She takes it to the gynecologist because that's what it means to be a woman. Like that's what you do with it once you have that body part. It was kind of
Everything
a
for that joke. I think they did it for the gag, for the joke, I think.
yeah,
I don't
yeah.
know. But yeah. Meg, you have your hand up. Thank you for your patience and allowing us to delve into Barbie before getting the point. Maybe you also wanted to ask about Barbie. We don't know.
I'm enjoying the Barbie digression. Yeah, something that confused me about the Barbie movie was the strong correlation between men and horses. I'm like, isn't horse girl a thing? I don't understand this imagery here. But anyway, that wasn't my question. To go back to something you were saying earlier, Kat, about how in reality it's not necessarily true that millennials are the generation that are not accomplishing anything, aren't buying homes, etc. And a lot of our talk today and in general has been about all of these negative stereotypes about millennials. And I'm just wondering if there's any positive stereotypes you would say there are about millennials, or anything that you think rings true for you personally that's like a good thing about being a millennial.
Well, I don't know if I've heard anybody say this about us, but I think it is a good thing. We are like kind of the only truly digital native generation. I think because, you know, we were present at the birth of a lot of the technology that's taken over now. We were there at the birth of the internet and the birth of social media. Zoomers apparently don't know what file folders are. They can't find things on their computers. Having existed in a world where technology was ubiquitous, but smartphones had not yet been invented, I think was a huge boon to us. I think we're able to understand the contours of the technology that we are like using in our lives in ways that people who are older don't, and people who are younger also don't, because like for them it's always been there, and for people who are older it was like it was too new, and they couldn't really figure out, they couldn't kind of integrate with it. So I think millennials are kind of uniquely in conversation with all of these tools that we're using, which is probably why it's millennials who are fueling now these massive leaps in AI. And I think like I'm sort of waiting to see how that plays out. But if we do end up in like the robot war, that's going to be because of millennials, for better or for worse. Maybe that's not a positive.
Thank you, Sarah Altman. That's so interesting that yeah. Okay, that may be for another song. I know that we've run out of time actually, so I won't get to ask my question, which was my secret agenda all along, whether millennials have killed the novel, and I think, and if so, why? Maybe we can tweet about this.